All right, everybody, man, you're back at Strong Inspirations, where we give it to you straight, no chasing. I got a guy on the channel that I'm excited that he's on. Man, he got a backdrop with books, and I know he read them all. He looked like he'd have read all these books. Man, this guy, I looked him up a little bit. He is proficient. And let me tell you how I found him, everybody. Watch this. I got video of a guy who found his family. He traced his family back to the 1700s. And he go back to the 1700s, met some of the white folk in his family, so on and so forth. I posted it on a Facebook group. This guy said he go back a little bit further. I said, man, come on the channel. Come on the channel, tell his story, let people know. So we can all know how to do it too, right? You know, if you want to, you know, you're so interested, you'll get a little understanding. It's not easy, but you take a little effort and you get there. And if you're so interested in learning your family, and this gentleman right here, that's what he did. And so everybody, first of all, let me say this. Y'all know I'm Anthony Brogdon. I forgot that part. I'm so excited because I'm really looking forward to hearing this. And I just ordinary guy that just came up with how we can share these historic these stories, history stories, and let everybody see it. I got a few things I want to say before I bring my man on the channel, and y'all know what I'm about to say. I want y'all to hit the subscribe button on Strong Inspirations. It's free, and we don't ask no questions. It just say you subscribe. I like that. I had over 100 subscribers the last 4 days. Thank y'all. I want you to hit the like button on this video, because I'm telling you, he's gonna tell you some stuff that's gonna blow your mind. I want you to hit the notifications bell, because when I put the videos up, and I do 3 or 4 of them a week, then you get a bing saying, hey, there's a new video on Strong Inspirations, you need to watch it. And there you go. And then I want you to tell somebody about Strong Inspiration. Don't keep it to yourself. You running around here talking like you, all these stories you watch, and people say, well, how you know all that? No, just tell them I just saw it on Strong Inspirations. And then I got a couple things on my own personal tip. As y'all might know, I'm a historian too. I'm good at this. And so I did a movie about it. It's called Business in the Black. It's a documentary. It's 75 minutes long. You will not go to sleep on this one, because it's going to blow your mind. Slaves who went to college, wow. Slaves who owned businesses, what them racists did to destroy Black business districts, all that's in this movie and more. You need to watch this. It's good. I'm telling you. I took it to 40 cities when I released it in 2014. No, 2017. 40 cities on my own dime. And people love it. And they loved it so much, they said, man, you need to put it in a book form. And that's what I did. I followed through on mine, my friends. And so I wrote Black Business Book. Get your copy. I'll autograph it. And it's good. It starts at 1619, when the slaves folk was brought here to America first. And there was we were here before that, but nonetheless, that's what they say, 1619. I started there, and because I talk about the rise of Black business in America, I focus on Black business. The last fact, because I stopped at 1960, is about Motown and what Barry Gordy did and that conglomerate that he had. But it's a lot of John Johnson and all them rich guys is in this book, Booker T. Washington's and A.G. Gaston's, all the Black banks and Black newspapers, Black colleges, all that's in here. I can keep going, but my man is nodding. He say, man, I got things to tell y'all. Come on, brother, let me tell it. And I'm gonna let him tell it in one more second, but y'all got to get you a copy of that. It's on my website, businessintheblack.net. Go to the website and order a copy today. I'll ship it out the same day you order it. And check this out, 2 more things on my book. If you read my book and you don't learn nothing new, I give your money back. You just send me a message, I knew all that. I figure you that smart. I give you money back. And for every 10th book I sell, I donate one to a school. Because if the teachers don't know this, how they gonna teach the kids?
That's right.
So all right, so y'all, that's my effort. This is bigger than me. This channel is bigger than me. And you hear me use this word strong a lot, right? Strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that's my introduction to my guest today. He is strong, brother. Come on, man, introduce yourself. Let's get it on.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity and for having me. I've been looking forward to this, and I wish my father was still living because I know he would enjoy reading your book.
Yeah,
I'm gonna get me.
Stop me right there. Man, what's your name? You got to say your name.
I'm sorry, I got so wound up in what you were saying.
Yeah.
My name is Charles Holman, and I am someone that has worked on my family history for more than 50 years. And I have to tell you, it is one of the things that I have enjoyed most. And it is something that no matter how much you think you found and how much you think you know about your family, there's always more to know and more to learn.
I got you. Let me ask you this. I don't mean no disrespect by interruptions because questions pop in my head. How did you even get to like to want to do that? What you used to sit down and talk to them and hear the stories, and how did it happen?
Well, you know, I'll tell you, I am from Lansing, not far from you there. And back when I was coming up, they were just beginning to integrate the schools. And I was in a class where I was the only Black person in the class. And most of the school were white students. And so we were definitely very much in the minority. And we got an assignment. This was in the 5th grade. And this is a typical assignment that school kids often get even today. And the assignment was to go home and find out where your people were from and why they came to America. And I'll tell you, that was probably about 1967. I'm giving away my age now.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was something that I'll be honest with you, I had never really thought about before that time.
Yeah, that's the 5th grade. I understand.
Yeah, this was the 5th grade. And this teacher that I had was, you know, was very, very good. It was a white teacher. This was the 1960s, and she was into the Civil Rights movement and followed Dr. King. And she was very unusual for that school and for her time. So anyway, I went home. I asked my mother, and she didn't really seem to know. She told me that we were in those days American Negroes, and she didn't know where we came from. She guessed we came from Africa. And in terms of, you know, pinning her down and, you know, in terms of where in Africa, because Africa is a huge continent.
Hey, that's right. That's right.
And there's a lot of different kind of people that live in Africa.
That's right.
You know, and she really couldn't tell me.
Yeah.
So I went back to school the next day, and the teacher was asking us, you know, the answers to the question. And all these white youngsters were coming forth with these beautiful tales about, you know, my folks were from, you know, France and from England, and they came here to seek their fortune. And I mean, they just went into details. And when it came my turn, there wasn't much I could say, because it really was something that we had not taken possession of yet.
Yeah.
At that point in the 1960s.
And I'm sure if you told your story, it would have been different than theirs, and it would have been, you know, some of them would have been like, oh man, well, okay, that's enough of that. You're talking about being slaves and all that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. They would not have understood what slavery was, how much we have to be proud of by the fact that we were enslaved people and survived all that. And about our culture before we even came to the United States. And like your book is showing, you know, we've got a fantastic history that occurred after slavery here in the United States.
But let me ask you this. I'm gonna talk about you just personally for a second. How did you feel being the only black kid in that school? Because you didn't start out. You probably went to a school where there were blacks, and here
I
you
did.
go with all whites. Did they try to beat you up?
Well, you know it.
Oh,
And that's
really?
just half of it. I mean, the name calling and, today, if someone were to call me the N-word, I laugh because if it's not one of my own, and you know what I'm talking about,
Uh-huh.
when I hear it from other people who are not my own, it's a sign of ignorance.
So hold on. You got called that in the 5th grade?
Oh man, I got called that from the day I started that school till probably the day I ended at that school.
Really?
But fortunately, towards the end, there were more and more black students coming in, and so I had other people to, to coalesce with and to
Yeah.
group with and to
Did you
identify.
tell the principal?
I don't believe I did. Although that's an interesting story there because
Yeah.
my sister was in a class, and my sister, is light skinned, and to me, I look at her and I could tell you she's black. I always knew she was black, and
Yeah.
that's my sister. But there are some people that sometimes had trouble, knowing exactly what her race was. And she was in
Yeah.
this class, and the teacher was teaching the class about a difficult math problem. And she said to the kids in the class, and these are grade school kids, she said that that problem was as difficult as, and she used the N word, in a woodpile.
Wow.
And my sister was stunned. I mean, she just a year older than me.
Yeah.
And she went home and she told my mother about it. And my mother belonged to a women's club, and she's a member of Delta Sigma Theta, which is,
Right.
one of our
Right.
big black sororities.
Right.
And she went back and she told one of her friends that was in this club and her sorority, what this teacher had done.
Right.
And her friend had just got elected to the school board. And her friend was a major force in the NAACP in Lansing.
Right. Right.
And, her friend's husband and her, they would raise money for the annual Freedom Fund dinner they had in Lansing. And the
So
attorney
they
that
did
was
something
part
to
of,
the teacher?
well, they did. And the attorney that was in the same building as my mother's friend, he was the main lawyer for the NAACP in Lansing, who was working to desegregate the schools, the late
Right.
Stuart Dunnings Jr.
Right.
Anyway, my mother told her friend, and they had a meeting with the principal, and the principal brought that teacher in. And let me tell you, I know this is a broadcast for general
Yeah.
consumption,
Yeah.
so I'm just going to put it mildly. They laid her out.
Oh,
And the
beautiful
teacher
thing.
got to keep her
Beautiful thing.
job, and she retired, a year or two later. But
Yeah.
that was the end of that. So
Yeah.
we had those kind of incidents. But, when I got home and told my folks about the experience, about, not knowing the history and what these other kids were saying, my stepdad listened to it very attentively, and he never forgot it. And a few years later, about I'd say maybe about 6 or 7 years later,
Uh-huh.
there was an announcement in the Lansing State Journal, which was our main newspaper in
Right.
Lansing. And it talked about this gentleman who had traced his ancestry all the way back to Africa. And the school district was bringing him to town to talk about what he had done and how you could do it too. And my stepdad, he put the Sunday paper down for a second. And he said, I think this is something that you might be interested in.
Okay.
He told me what it was, and he said, maybe you'd like to go. And I said, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
this is
Yeah.
something I wanted to know. I
Right.
had
Right.
felt inferior when we had that assignment, and I didn't have the knowledge. And so we arranged to go, and the man that spoke was none other than the late Alex Haley.
Whoa.
And this was in February of 1973. And we sat right in the front row. It was at the Lansing Civic Center. And, he laid it out. First, he talked about his background and how
Right,
he had
right,
written this book called The Autobiography of Malcolm X,
right.
who was a figure right there in Lansing that had spent part of his youth in that
Sure
Lansing.
did.
And which, interestingly enough, my dad's sister had known him when they were kids,
Right.
and he had written her a love letter.
Mm.
And she didn't really like him, and so she threw it away. And years later, he became well known and a very
Yeah.
famous figure. And incidentally, before I get back to this part about Alex Haley,
Yeah.
when my father's sister, my aunt, died in the early 2010s,
Yeah.
it turned out that Malcolm X had written her another letter that he'd never sent.
Mm.
And that letter was something that his family donated along with all of his papers to Emory University in Atlanta.
Yes.
And sure enough, there was that letter that he'd
Oh
written
man, what
to
a beautiful
my
story.
Aunt Zelma. And
Yeah.
when you hear a story like that as
Yeah.
kids, you tend to think they're making this up.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
But when
Sure.
you see one of the letters that's
Yeah.
been preserved in a historical place like Emory's
Yes.
Woodruff Library, then it takes on a whole
Yeah. Oh,
nother
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
feature. But anyway, getting back to this
Yep.
Alex Haley
Yep.
thing, he'd written the biography, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And he told us about a book that he was in the process of writing then in 1973, which was going to be called Roots.
Yep.
And it was fascinating. And, when he finished, everybody stood up and gave him a standing ovation. And little did we know that 3 years later, there would be the television miniseries and the
Oh
book would
yeah,
be
that
out.
changed
And
America.
man, it changed everything.
Yeah.
But he was one of the primary inspirations for me wanting to learn my family history. And the really good thing, too, about what he did was in the early 1970s, there were people still living in my family who had known some of our ancestors who had been enslaved.
Yeah. Oh sure.
And my grandmother was one of them, and grandmother was from Canada. And she knew the story of when her grandparents had escaped from slavery in Kentucky to Canada. And she was able to tell us, the details about how they escaped and what they went through, both of her maternal grandparents, and what happened to them once they got to Canada.
Did they
But
go to Nova Scotia or were they in
no,
Windsor?
they escaped from Louisville, Kentucky, and they went to Ontario, and they settled outside of Windsor.
Yeah. Okay.
And they went back into the country because they were afraid that if they went and settled in Windsor, the slave catchers could come into Windsor and get them and take them back into slavery, in Kentucky.
So we would assume that their slave catchers were really vicious and wanted them back to have to go that far. Because once they got to Detroit, it could be okay or what have you.
Usually it was, but the situation here was my grandmother's grandmother, after she got free, she kept going back and she kept rescuing other people.
Really?
And so eventually there was a reward for her capture, which was my grandmother's telling the story that it was so high that she couldn't risk going back to get other people. Now, that was the side of the story my grandmother told me when I was a teenager. When I became an adult and started telling the story to other members of my family, I was at a family reunion.
Yeah.
And a very old relative, she came up to me and she put her hand on my arm and she said, "I know that story." And I said, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yes, indeed. The reason why she kept going back was she had been impregnated by that slaveholder. She had had a child by him, and she had to leave the child when she escaped, but she couldn't bear to be without that child.
So she went back to get the
So
child.
she kept going back to try to get her child. But the slaveholder, to get back at her or to prevent her from getting the child, moved the child or sold the child so she couldn't get him. So instead, each time when she went back to try to find him, she helped other people escape in that process.
Okay, let's now how about this? That you own to something here, right, with me. How do you think first she escaped? Did you hear the story? It was late at night and it was raining real hard and she ran, and then how did she get back? Do you know that part?
Well, I know some of the story, and I've
Okay.
learned more as a result of DNA and some of the things that I've been
Okay.
able to do since. But what happened was the slaveholder was an older man, and apparently he died, which gave her an opportunity during that period to try to get away. Now, he had a wife and he had an extended family there in Louisville, but she was able to also connect up with the man who became her husband, my great-great-grandfather, and he was also enslaved in Louisville. But his slave owner's daughter taught him how to read and write, which was illegal in those days.
Right.
And he was kind of a playmate to the daughter's son. And the daughter lived with her mother. They were both widows, and they lived in Louisville. And my great-great-grandmother connected with my great-great-grandfather. They got to the Ohio River, and there was a band of Quakers that helped them plan the escape and carry it out. And the Quakers arranged for them to meet an old man at the Ohio River who could ferry them across the river. And there was also a minister there who married them, in the course of the escape at the river. And the old man told them that he could get them across, but he wanted to sell them a lucky charm. And if they bought the lucky charm from him, it would ensure their safety, that they would make it to freedom, and they had to promise to never open the lucky charm. Otherwise, they would be in danger. So, of course, they bought the lucky charm. He got them across the river, and once across the river, the Quakers put my great-great-grandmother on a train. And because she was a light-skinned woman, there was, we as Black people can often tell when a light-skinned person is African American,
Right.
Black. We can tell.
Right.
There are things that we can see,
right,
because our eyes are attuned to it.
right.
But there are Caucasian people who aren't attuned in the
I
same
got
way.
you.
So great-great-grandmother, the Quakers dressed her up as a widow in mourning. They put her in a long black dress, and they put a veil over her face and a hat on her head. And they disguised her so they could pass her off as a white woman on this train.
I got you.
And they told her, do not speak to anyone on the train, nod your head yes or indicate no with your head, but don't speak to anyone. And she got on the train took her to Detroit. And meanwhile, my great-great-grandfather, and we have a picture of him, and I wish I had it where I could show you right now, but I'm still learning this technology.
Yeah.
He was not able to disguise himself in that manner. So he was able to be given places of where he could go to each night along the way between Louisville and Detroit, safe houses where he could stop and get refreshment and then take off again at night.
Right.
So anyway, after a period of time, my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather both made it to Detroit. And once they got to Detroit, the Quakers arranged to have them taken across the river into Canada. And as I said, they went further than Windsor because there was a reward out for my great-great-grandmother at some point, and she feared being captured.
So
Now,
she had to be a real I don't, from lack of a better way, a bad mother school to
she
do that
was.
and then to go back.
Well, she was, but the other part of it is never doubt the bond between a mother and a child.
I love it. I love it.
And a mother will go through high hell for her child.
Okay, how about this? Did she ever find her child?
Well, that's a good question, because after my elderly aunt, as I was telling you, touched my arm at the family reunion and told me about her having this child and having to leave it, I found my great-great-grandmother's grave over in Windsor, and she died in 1902. And I stood over the grave, and this is going to sound crazy, but I spoke to the grave and I said, I am so sorry that you had to leave your child and weren't able to get him. And, then I just paused and just stood there in silence. But I'll tell you, there was a feeling that came over me of peace. I didn't hear any voices. I didn't see no ghost. It was summertime. It was daylight. I just felt this incredible sense of peace. And it made no sense to me. I mean, this is a terrible situation, having to leave your child. But years later, as I began to study this, especially after DNA came out, which really, really, man, DNA is dynamite. It will cut through time. It'll cut through, brick walls. It will get you where you need to go when you decide to research your family tree. Well, anyway, years later, I was doing the DNA and tested a number of my cousins and tested a cousin who was related to me only through these great-great-grandparents that escaped. And I was comparing her test result to other people in my family. And I found that she was matching on the same side of my family as my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather who had escaped from slavery. And so I looked at this lady's family tree and I didn't see the connection. But I took her family tree and I began to work on it. And I took it back further than what she had done. Because, when you've been at this a long time, you learn things. Certain records to look for.
Sure.
And I took it back further than she had.
And
that's where I saw the connection. My great-great-grandmother's maiden name was Granderson. And it turned out this lady had an ancestor named Lucinda Granderson in the same place, Louisville, Kentucky, where my great-great-grandmother escaped.
Man, you got me. Get me to the punchline. So it's the
it blew me away. And, when you're working on Ancestry.com and you have all these matches, a lot of times you don't know what to make of these matches because there's so many, and you're not going to recognize these people's names. And a lot of times when you try to contact these people, they're going to blow you off. But this lady who was the match, I reached out to her and I told her what I had found. And this lady, I mean, she's involved in the community where she lives, she's AKA down there and done a lot of stuff for the National Urban League. And she really believes in our people and learning our history. And she responded right off the bat. And so we began to talk further. We began to compare notes. And lo and behold, when we looked at her ancestor Lucinda's entry in the 1970 United States Census for Louisville, Kentucky, we found that she had a young man living with her, and his name was Elias Pendergrass. And Pendergrass was the same name as the slaveholder who had enslaved my great-great-grandmother right there in Louisville.
And that's him.
And it indicated in the census that this was not her child. It indicated that, it was a stepchild is what they indicated in the census. And it indicated that the child was, as they said in those days on those forms, they put an M next to his race, which stood for mulatto, which is a term
Right.
we don't like and is a term that we don't use today. But
Right.
back then, that's what they used to denote people who were of mixed race heritage.
Right.
And as I began to search more and more, I realized that's the child.
Whoa, my
That's
God.
great-great-grandmother's son. And we've since done more DNA testing, and we've found more of the patterns that help to corroborate that that is her son. But it's interesting that her son not only found her family that was still there in Louisville, but he became one of the first Black teachers in Louisville at a school in the 1860s and the early 1870s, which was run by a federal agency called the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yep.
And the Freedmen's Bureau was setting up schools all over what had been the slave South.
Right.
And he was a teacher at one of them. And it's interesting because as you look further into those records, you find there was an incident that arose. And you have to realize in those days, public schools didn't exist like they do today in most places.
Sure.
And so to have a government-run school for African-American children where there may not have been government-run schools for white children
Right.
was a point of conflict. And his school was located in an area where there were a lot of Irish immigrant people. And some of them were people who were struggling economically and were in some ways in competition with the newly freed people.
Right.
So there was resentment that Black children were getting a free education, which may not have been available to others.
Right.
So an incident occurred, and the Black students on their way to class would be pelted with rocks by some of these young white kids. And one day, one of the kids threw rocks at one of the Black kids, and the Black kid got inside the school building and threw rocks back. And the little white kid ran home and told his mother, and his mother comes back to the school. And, this isn't unusual because this kind of stuff occurs today even.
Okay, I got you.
And the mother came back to the school and she wanted to know which one of the boys had thrown these rocks at her son. And my great-great-grandmother's son, who was the teacher, told her that he wasn't going to tell which of his kids and that she should leave the property immediately. So she went and got two white men, and they came back to the school, and they threatened great-great-grandmother's son and told him they were going to shoot him and all what they were going to do to him. And so great-great-grandmother's son was afraid for his students and himself. He went to the police, which is what, you do.
Yeah, sure.
Today, even, we know there's problems with some police officers in Louisville.
Sure.
And you only have to think about Brianna to know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, sure.
Brianna, who is dead and who the officers still have not been prosecuted for coming into her house and shooting her in her own house. But anyway, getting back to the story, he went to the police. The police wouldn't do anything. And so he went to the federal soldiers who were still stationed there. And he told them and the officers of the Freedmen's Bureau what had happened.
Right.
And they investigated it. And let me tell you, they put a stop to it. So, he became a teacher. He taught Black students. And, the family was reunited. But my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-grandfather, they had a number of children. They stayed in Canada for the rest of their life, although most of their children eventually came back to the United States, as is the case for a lot of people who went to Canada to be free, but once slavery was over, returned to the United States.
So now let me ask you this. For people who don't know, and give us the short version in this regard, how do you get your DNA? Once you get it, what do you do with it? You send it somewhere, you take it to the hospital. How do you know the codes?
Well,
what happens
what
there?
you do, and it's really easy to do, is there are a number of companies out there that do DNA for family tree purposes. And you have to decide which one you want to use.
I got you there.
The biggest one is called Ancestry DNA.
Right.
There's another one called 23andMe. There's another one called Family Tree DNA.
Right.
There's another one called MyHeritage, and the list goes on and on and on.
Right.
A lot of people choose Ancestry DNA because it has the largest database.
Okay.
And I have utilized them, although I don't recommend them for African American people. And we can go into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
If you want. But basically what you do is you get a DNA kit from one of these companies.
Right.
You either spit into a tube or you take a Q-tip like device and rub it on the inside of your cheek.
Right.
And put that in a tube.
Right.
You seal it up, you mail it off, and in a few weeks, they notify you that they have completed the processing of your DNA. And here's all the people who are your immediate and distant cousins. And I mean, this thing can go back hundreds of years.
Okay.
And once you get that DNA and you begin to test back, and once you begin to focus on those matches, and you're not going to recognize most of those names.
Right, sure.
But once you begin to focus on them, especially the ones that already have family trees, that is your starting point.
I got you.
And the closer the DNA test indicates you are related to the person, say, for example, it may tell you somebody's a second cousin or third cousin, fourth cousin, or whatever. The closer related you are to them, the more closer in time you share ancestors.
So now you go back to how far in your family?
Well, it depends on which branch of the family. The branch I was telling you about that escaped from slavery, we can take the African Americans on that branch back to 1795 and 1792 for my great-great-grandfather's father. But the interesting thing is, you know, once you start getting into this DNA and once you start getting into slavery, you find that African American women today are irresistible. But back in the day of slavery, they were even more irresistible.
Meaning the white man couldn't stop himself.
And many a slaveholder would not keep his hands off of African American women. And there really was nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, right.
They had all the power, they had the law on their side. And if you escaped from slavery, the law was so twisted that they would call you a fugitive for having escaped.
Yep.
Now, how could that be in the land of the free and the brave? And Patrick Henry, who said, give me liberty or give me death.
Right.
But if you as an enslaved person escaped, they made you a fugitive and called you a fugitive slave and had laws designed to not only reach out and grab you, but to put you back in slavery and probably even result in you being sold to an even worse slaveholder.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So now you find, like, for example, you find this DNA thing comes up and you find names. Then you can take those names and find some records by going to where?
Yes, the records are very, very important, and the DNA is your link to the records. One of the main things we look at are the United States censuses. And these are things that you can look at online for free. And I can tell you about some of the places where you can see them.
Right.
But the 1870 census is the first United States census where African Americans were free. And it is the first United States census where you will see probably all Black Americans listed by name, age, sex, and also their racial designation of Black or mulatto or whatever. And you can begin from that document to see a lot of your ancestors and take them back to a point before slavery. You can also look at the 1880 census, the 1900 census, all the way up until 1940. And for some people, it's best to start with 1940 because usually you will recognize your grandparents or other people whose names you know in that 1940 census, and then
Okay.
work your way back. But you know, the DNA, when you start looking at these people that are related to you in their trees, it will show you some of the records connected with these people. And oftentimes you can find your families in those records.
Okay, hold on, let me stop you right there. When you say records, you could find a record that says what they did. There might be something in the newspaper, that kind of thing.
Well, the censuses will tell you usually what their occupation was. It'll tell you whether they owned real estate, whether they owned their home, whether they rented their home, all kinds of detail like that. What state they were born in, what state their parents were from. And it kind of becomes your basis for looking for other records.
I got you.
But some of the other records we look at that are online is we look at military pension records. And a lot of times we will look at the records of people who served in the US Army during the Civil War, because that was probably the war in our history, the first war in our history, where many, many, many Black men served for the first time. And I think you had over 100,000 African-American men who served on the Union side during the Civil War. And if you can find that you have an ancestor or a relative of an ancestor that served in that war, you can also see in those records whether they filed for a pension when they got old, or whether their widow filed for a pension. And if you find that's the case, those records are golden, man.
Okay.
Those records will tell you, like a biography, who enslaved them, where they were enslaved,
Oh, really?
what they did when they were enslaved, how they became free in a lot of situations, what they did after they became free, what their health was like, what they died of, who their children were, when they got married. I mean, man, it's like golden.
Okay.
You know,
okay, let me stop you right there. So
record.
in your family, how far back do you go? Like you said, 1700s, like of the ones further back, do you know what somebody did? Can you tell us that kind of story?
Well, some of them.
Like what did they do?
The great-great-grandmother that I was telling you about, who escaped from slavery, her father is a man we believe was named Darby Granderson. And he worked for the enslaver, the white man who enslaved him. He worked for him as a teamster, would probably be the best word for it. He transported goods that the slaveholder produced, transported them from the plantation where they all lived to marketplaces in Louisville and elsewhere.
He transferred the what now? What did you say?
Transferred the goods and the products.
Oh, goods, okay.
And what this particular slaveholder did was he came to Kentucky in the 1790s, and actually just a little bit before that. But he got a hold of land where there was a bubbling spring that came up from the earth, you know, water that was coming from the earth. And the water was salty. And he realized that if they could take that water and dry it out, the salt that was left was something he could sell. So they created a big manufacturing process for taking the water that was bubbling up out of the earth and distilling the salt out of it, and then taking it to markets where they could sell it.
I see.
And in those days where people didn't have refrigerators, they used salt as a way to preserve their food. And the work involved in distilling salt from salty water is very, very labor intensive. So what he did was he bought enslaved people to do that heavy, difficult work in the hot Kentucky summers. And then he used slaves to take the final product from his home, his plantation, to markets in Louisville and West Virginia and various places. So this is what we believe my great-great-grandmother's father did. And it's interesting because as I began to go into these records, and especially the military records, they helped me to find the slaveholder, and they gave me access to the slaveholder's family's name and his name. And once you get that, you can begin to investigate that slaveholder and find out what they did and how they did it and how many people they enslaved. But the interesting thing was, I reached out to that slaveholder's living descendants who live in Louisville to this day.
Okay.
And these people, at first I was a little hesitant to reach out to them because, when you know your ancestor was mistreated and escaped because of the mistreatment, you don't know who you're dealing with.
Right.
But one of the things you learn in this process is you cannot hold people responsible for things their ancestors did 100 years before they were even born.
I got you.
None of us are responsible for what our ancestors do. We want to know that history, and we want to learn from that history, but we want to approach it like a surgeon, where we're going to dig out the information that we need, we're going to dissect those records, and we're going to learn about our families. So I contacted the slaveholders' descendants, and one of them turned out to be a lawyer like I am. And there are other lawyers in their family, and they still own all this land outside of Louisville where they had their operations. And the town where they did all this stuff is still named after their slaveholder ancestors. And they have businesses there. The school is named after them. The shopping center is named after them.
Okay.
The subdivision is named after them. But I contacted them, and the man was very nice to me. He said, we found records in an old trunk when my grandmother died. And in that trunk were records involving the people that they enslaved.
Wow.
And if you want to see those records, I will send them to you on a CD. Now,
wow.
When I heard that, I was like, man, I don't think I can wait for no CD. I need to get down there.
Yeah.
When you're working and you've got a lot of things going on, you can't do that. So I told him, send me the CD, whatever it costs, I'd be glad to pay it. Just send it. Well, the man didn't want to take no money from me. He sent me the records totally free of charge. And I got those records, and in those records was an 1817 deed. And that deed told of the sale of my ancestor to this slaveholder. And it told the name of the man that he bought my ancestor for. And like I said, it was dated 1817. And it turned out actually 2 of my ancestors were named in that document. And he said they had additional records. So I contacted him again and told him what I found. And I said, I want to come down there and see this place and see what else you got. And he said, come on.
Okay.
So I flew into Louisville and rented a car and drove out there. And he showed me one of the original plantation houses that's still standing. And he gave me a tour of it, gave me a tour of the plantation.
Wow.
But what was most interesting about it, there was 5 slave cabins originally, and they tore all of them down but one. And one of them they're using today as a shed. And he told me, if you like, I'll be happy to show it to you. And you know,
Yeah.
I was going to see that because I mean,
Yeah.
that was the main reason I
Yeah.
was there, to learn
Yeah.
about my
Yeah.
enslaved
Yeah.
ancestors. And so they unlocked the door to the place. I went in there, and the place was so small, it was the size of a small shed.
Okay, I got you.
And there was an attic to the place. And I began to realize, this is where an entire family of enslaved people lived. And the kids probably stayed up in the attic and the rafters. It's interesting because the cabin was not built of wood, it was built of brick. And I realized, my ancestors probably made this brick
Yeah, they did.
that this slave cabin is made out of, and probably made the bricks that the main house is made out of. But I walk through that place, and these people are steady talking to me as I'm looking at it. And I have to tell you, man, I was in stunned silence. And I really could not find the words to describe what I was feeling. It was
Yeah,
just
right.
that overwhelming. And one of them didn't go into the cabin with me. They stood outside, and they had a camera, and they took a picture of me as I was coming out of that cabin. And I look at that picture now, and I'm looking at the ground, and I realize, man, when that picture was taken, your head was swimming. You were just overwhelmed, and it's a moment
Yeah,
that I will take with me for the rest of my life.
I'm sure.
And then, this family, they told me about how the enslaved people were fed, and, the slaveholder's wife, how she would ration out portions to each of the enslaved people. And the guy that was telling me all this, he was a retired school board member in Louisville, and his cousin was a lawyer. And this guy's daughter was actually a lawyer. And they had another cousin who actually was a lawyer too, who owned all of this property today. And most of these people were with me on this expedition. And I'm afraid that I really, at that point, I could not be, engaging and friendly, because I was drowning in emotions. I just,
I'm sure.
and then, you get home and you start going through these records and thinking about it, and you start to put it all together, and you realize that, there are people who hold our history in their hands. And sometimes they don't know what to do with these documents.
Yeah,
They're
sure.
ashamed. They're ashamed that their ancestors enslaved people. They don't know how people are going to take it.
Sure, sure.
They almost want to cover it up, because
Sure.
today, you would be very hard pressed to find anybody who will tell you that slavery was a good thing.
Yeah.
It was not a good thing.
That's right.
It was a horrible,
That's right.
horrible thing. And to think that people could do this to other human beings and enslave the children they had by enslaved people, and treat people so badly. I mean, there is no way that I will ever feel that that was a good thing, or in any way a noble
Right,
thing.
right.
It is something that this country needs to make reparations for,
Yes.
and needs to not cover up,
Yes.
but needs to help us to find this history, to document it, and come to terms with it, whether we are Black or whether people are white.
Yes.
Because white people need to understand slavery as well.
Yeah.
They need to understand sometimes that the wealth that they enjoy today is wealth stolen from Black people.
That's
and like
right.
I told you, these people lived in the town where they had all this land, the school was their name by them, and so on and so forth. Well, the money to do those things and to hold on to those things is in part due to my ancestors that these records revealed.
Everybody, we can keep going. I got to stop him right there.
All right.
I gotta stop him right there. It's getting emotional for me, for sure. Feeling your emotion right now, my friend. I feel your emotion right now.
Yes.
I feel your emotion right now. Everybody, this is what I do with Strong Inspirations. I find these people somehow, some way, and let them tell the story. If you don't like this video, if you do not hit the button on this video, I'll come and I'll find another one for you too. But please like this video. Subscribe to the channel. It's free. Hit the notifications bell so you know when the videos come up. Tell somebody about Strong Inspirations. This thing is a mission to let us share these stories. To you, my brother, I say this. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming on here. I say with all sincerity, I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing, finding your history and sharing it with us. Write that book, put it out there, lecture on this, whatever your heart, deems you to do and your time allows. But keep it going, please.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you
I've
for being on the
enjoyed
channel,
this.
everybody. I'm gonna stop there. Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
You too.